The dry wind scraped dust through the chapel square where the townspeople had gathered, half in silence, half in suspicion. Peace was being honored again, and like always, it was being done loudly, with sharp words and forced gestures. But Karen didn't speak. She stood still in the center of it all, veil trembling around her face, hands folded, not in prayer, but in numb defiance. It had been 3 weeks since her husband died. A drunkard, a fool, run through in a deal, gone wrong with the Blackfoot. No one said it out loud, but the town had made its judgment. It was her fault. She was too quiet, too proud, too strange. Her silence unnerved them. Her sorrow made them uncomfortable. Her presence, now widowed and barren, was an inconvenience they were eager to trade. And so, when the town council forged a new treaty with the Blackfoot, hoping to cool tensions before spring, the offerings were clear: 5 head of cattle, 6 sacks of flour, and last, her, a woman with no husband, no land, no child. A gesture of peace, they said. A kindness. She didn't protest. They hadn't asked. The man who stepped forward from the Blackfoot was not what she expected. His face was painted in solemn streaks that shimmered like obsidian in the sun, unmoving and unreadable. He didn't leer at her. He didn't measure her like grain. In fact, he didn't look at her at all, until the mayor stepped back and muttered with finality, "She's yours now." The moment cracked like dry bone in the wind. Karen lowered her eyes. The veil tickled her cheek, still scented faintly of candles and cellar stone. She hadn't cried since the day they dragged her up from beneath the chapel. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. She hadn't spoken since the pastor's wife tied her braid too tight and hissed, "If you're to be given, at least look neat." Her wedding ring, thick brass, still clung to her finger like a curse. She wanted to tear it off, but couldn't. Not in front of them, not like this. The crowd waited, breath caught, expecting the warrior to take her wrist, to pull her forward into whatever cart or camp lay beyond the hills. But he didn't. He reached into the leather pouch at his waist and pulled out a folded piece of hide. He handed it to the mayor. It was payment. Trade, not gift. Then, for the first time, he turned to her. His voice didn't boom. It didn't command. It made the wind hush. "I bought a life," he said, "not a servant." The words struck harder than any blow she'd ever known. She blinked, stunned, her lips parting. His eyes met hers, not with demand, not with pity, but with something she hadn't seen in years. Invitation. "You walk when you're ready," he said simply, and turned to leave. No pull, no demand, just distance widening. Karen didn't move, couldn't. Her legs felt carved from stone. Her ears buzzed with the shame of being traded, but something deeper stirred beneath the weight of it. Not rage, not hope, recognition. Her foot shifted, then another. Still wearing the same dress they'd buried her in, she began to walk, not toward salvation, not toward love, but toward something unspoken and unpromised. The crowd watched her go. No one called her name. No one stopped her. They'd never seen a woman walk that slow and still look free. McCoy, the warrior who had spoken the unspeakable, didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew. And Karen, for the first time in weeks, felt air reach her lungs in a way that almost resembled breath. The walk to his dwelling wasn't far, but for Karen, it stretched longer than any distance she'd ever known. The mountain air was thin, laced with pine and old smoke. Her shoes sank into damp soil, and every step felt like a question she didn't yet know how to ask. McCoy walked just ahead of her, his back steady, his pace patient. He never turned around to check if she followed. Somehow, that made her follow more. When they reached the lodge, it rose from the ground like it had always belonged there, rounded, stitched together with hide and timber, smoke curling gently from the top vent. No fences, no dogs, no gate to close behind her, just space. He held the flap open, said nothing. She paused, not out of fear, but uncertainty. Then she stepped inside. The warmth was soft, not stifling. A small fire danced in the center. Blankets lined the edges. A basin of clean water shimmered beside the hearth. McCoy moved with quiet precision, ladling broth into 2 wooden bowls. He placed one in front of her, then sat a few feet away and drank from the other, eyes on the flame. Still, she didn't sit. Her arms were crossed so tightly they ached. "You're safe here," he said. His voice didn't press or coax. It landed gently like moss on stone. I will not ask anything you do not give. Her lips parted. Her voice cracked. Then, why take me? McCoy didn't flinch. Because if I had not, they would have given you to a worse man, or to no one at all. And you deserve more than to be discarded like bone. She stood, frozen. Her breath hitched, not because of what he said, but because of how unfamiliar it felt, being told she deserved something. You don't know what I deserve, she said sharply. I know what no one deserves, he replied, to be traded without a voice. That silenced her. She lowered herself slowly to the fur-lined floor, knees folding awkwardly, like her body no longer remembered how to be soft. The bowl of broth sat untouched between them, steaming faintly. It smelled of roots and marrow. It smelled like something meant for staying. What now? She asked, eyes down. McCoy shrugged, a single motion like a falling leaf. You sleep. You heal. You remember how to speak on your own terms. She blinked, not at him, but at the space around her, at the absence of everything she'd come to fear. No ropes, no cuffs, no commands barked over her shoulder, just a lodge with no locked door and a man who didn't reach for her even once. Her stomach growled, embarrassingly loud. She reached for the bowl and took a sip. The taste was simple, but it wasn't empty. It tasted like permission. That night, as McCoy stepped outside to tend the firewood, she lay beneath a fir she had chosen herself. The act of choosing something so small felt revolutionary. Her fingers drifted to her wedding ring. She twisted it once, then again. Finally, she slipped it free and tucked it beneath the edge of the bedding, not as a rebellion, as a release. It no longer marked loyalty, only ownership. She didn't cry, not yet, but she didn't sleep either. She stared at the curve of the ceiling, listening to the wind brush against the lodge like breath, and for the first time she wondered, not what McCoy wanted from her, but why he hadn't taken anything at all. In the morning, golden light slipped through the flap and kissed her cheek. For one impossible moment, she forgot where she was. There were no slamming doors, no shouting, no footsteps pacing behind her, just silence. She sat up slowly, her hair tangled from sleep, her heart fluttering with a weight that hadn't settled yet. She reached for her braid, still tight, still bound by the same black ribbon the pastor's wife had tied before they gave her away. She held it, then pulled. One tug, then another. The braid fell apart. Her hair spilled wild across her shoulders, uneven, neglected, but undeniably hers. When she stepped outside, McCoy was crouched by the stream, hands stained with ochre, painting a bow. He looked up, nodded, then returned to his work. You knew I'd come out, she said. No, he answered without looking up. But I left food in case you did. She glanced at the bundle beside the stone, flatbread, dried meat, an apple. I undid the braid, she said quietly. She didn't know why she wanted him to know. He didn't look up. Good, he said. That was never mine to keep. Her throat clenched, because deep down, beneath the frost still crusting her ribs, something stirred. A need, not for love, not for rescue, but for something harder to name, to be seen and not taken, to be heard without asking, to matter just because. She still breathed. The days passed not in declarations, but in rhythms. Karen woke to silence that didn't punish her. She stepped into light that didn't demand a smile. McCoy didn't ask where she was going or when she'd return. There was no schedule, no duty, no tether, just the steady crackle of firewood and the shifting sounds of a life built with space instead of walls. It unsettled her at first. She had been so long without choices that the absence of orders felt like falling. But McCoy never filled the silence with expectation. He simply lived beside it. One morning, while the wind still carried the edge of frost, Karen noticed the axe leaning against the woodpile. She had passed it before, ignored it. But today, something in her feet turned. She walked to it, placed a hand on the handle. McCoy was by the creek, scraping bark for dye. She called out, unsure of the words, "Will you show me?" He looked up, not surprised, not proud, just present. He nodded and walked over, wiping his hands on his tunic. He didn't take the axe from her. He simply stepped beside her and said, "Hold it like this." His hands guided hers, firm, warm, brief. Then he stepped back. The first strike missed, the second too. The third split the log with a crack that echoed through her bones. She didn't smile, but something inside her uncoiled. "I had to learn fast once," she muttered. "Back home, mistakes meant doors locked behind you." McCoy's gaze darkened, not in anger at her, but in quiet rage for her. "No one locks doors here," he said, "not even the wind." They chopped side by side until her arms trembled. Her breath came in short, hard bursts, but she didn't stop, not until the pile was full, and the ache in her muscles matched the rhythm of something real. Effort that meant survival, not subjugation. That night, she baked bread over the fire, burnt at the edges, uneven. McCoy ate it anyway, saying nothing, but the second time she made it, it didn't burn, and that silence felt like a sunrise. Later, as the lodge filled with the scent of wood smoke and thyme, Karen caught herself humming. The tune was old, fragile, something her mother had sung when the world was still soft. She hadn't realized she remembered it. "You should have left me in that town," she said suddenly, the words bitter in her throat. "It wasn't your fight." McCoy stirred the stew, not looking at her. "It was my fire they tried to douse," he said, "and I will not trade peace for silence." She studied him then, really looked, at the way his hands moved with care, at the long scar across his temple that hadn't been there when she arrived. "Battle?" she asked. "Falling," he replied. "I was young, thought standing alone made me strong. The mountain disagreed." Karen's breath hitched. "A laugh? Maybe, or something like it." "My people didn't fall," she said. They just pushed others off." McCoy met her eyes, steady and unblinking. "They pushed you, and still you're here." She didn't answer, not out loud. But when she went to bed that night, she didn't lie curled in the corner of her fur. She lay centered, straight, as if the ground belonged to her again. And when she whispered to the fire, it wasn't an apology. It was a vow. "I want to stay." She wasn't sure if McCoy heard her, but in the hush that followed, the wind outside softened, as if even the trees had paused to listen. The next morning, she found the wedding ring tucked beneath her bedding. The brass one, the ugly one, the one that had once declared ownership. She took it to the creek and held it beneath the surface until her fingers turned white from the cold. Then she let it go. It sank between two stones. She didn't watch it vanish. When she returned to the lodge, McCoy was waiting with cedar logs stacked in his arms. He didn't ask where she'd gone. She didn't offer it, but something had changed, and they both felt it. Later that afternoon, while stitching the winter lining of the lodge wall, Karen pricked her finger. A single bead of blood welled at the tip. She stared at it, not because it hurt, but because it reminded her she was still capable of healing, still alive. She wiped it away with a scrap of cloth and kept sewing, not out of duty, but because the lodge was hers now too. The world didn't shift with thunder. It changed in quiet ways, like the way Karen reached for her water without hesitating, or the way she stopped flinching when McCoy moved behind her. The lodge no longer felt like a shelter offered. It felt like a place she had slowly helped build. And yet, something still clung to her ribs. Some mornings she woke breathless, not from dreams, but from memory. The chapel, the pastor's voice, the tightness of the black ribbon strangling her braid, the way her husband's hand had lingered too long on her shoulder, never out of love, always as a warning. It was the past, yes, but it was also inside her. The veil sat at the bottom of her satchel, folded, pressed, wrapped in the same cloth they had shoved at her when they gifted her away. It still smelled of rose water and candle smoke. She had tried to forget it was there. Until now. McCoy was by the creek, carving arrowheads in the sun. She didn't tell him what she was doing. Karen knelt by the edge of the clearing, near the line of trees where pine gave way to mountain grass. She dug with her hands. The earth was cold but soft from snowmelt. It clung to her fingers under her nails. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just unfolded the veil once, then again, and placed it in the dirt like a body. When she covered it, she pressed the soil flat with her palms. The chill reached into her skin, into her bones. But this time, it didn't hurt. It steadied her. Behind her, the breeze shifted. She didn't turn, but she knew McCoy had seen. When she returned to the fire, he said nothing for a long while. Then gently, "That veil, it belonged to your husband." She stared into the flames. "No," she said softly, "it belonged to the woman they wanted me to be." He nodded once. "Then it's right to bury her." That night she helped with the stew, only a little, cutting roots, stirring broth, but it mattered. She moved without being told, without asking permission. Later, they sat across from each other, the silence between them no longer hollow. It held weight, like stone, like truth. Karen looked at him, not as the warrior she had been given to, but as the man who had not taken her. "Do the others know?" she asked suddenly. He lifted his eyes. "Your people?" She nodded. "That you took me." "I sent word," he said. "Told them I traded for peace, not property." "And they believed you?" "They believe I would not lie." Karen looked away. "The people who gave me away, they lied with every word they used to bless me." McCoy's voice was low, steady. "Then stop speaking their language in your heart." She froze. The words struck something deep, not like a wound, but like a doorway. Later, alone in her bedroll, she pressed her fingers to the spot where the veil had once rubbed against her scalp. Gone. Not burned, not torn. Buried, like something that had lived, but did not deserve to be carried further. Outside, McCoy murmured softly in his language, not to her, not even to the spirits, but to the night itself, like a man who did not need to be answered to feel understood. The next day, the sky broke open with a storm, not from the heavens, but from the land itself. Wind roared in sideways, dragging dirt and sleet across the ridgeline. Karen and McCoy had just returned from gathering wild onions when the first gust hit. Her skirt whipped around her legs, her braid loosened and flailed behind her like a banner of defiance. Inside the lodge, she stripped off her wet shawl, her fingers numb. But her shaking wasn't from cold alone. It was memory. One stormy night, years ago, her husband had locked her on the porch for forgetting the salt in his stew. That night, she'd banged on the door until her knuckles bled. No one opened it. Now, as the wind shrieked around the hide walls, Karen crouched near the fire, wrapped in fur, trembling. McCoy passed her a bowl of steaming broth, then sat beside her, close but not touching. "You've seen worse," he said quietly. She closed her eyes, voice barely above breath. "Yes, but never with someone waiting inside." Her throat tightened, not from pain, from release. McCoy didn't respond with words. He only nodded, the fire flickering in his eyes. "Many storms are survived outside," he said, "but they do not leave you whole." Karen turned toward him. "Then maybe I'm not whole." "You will be," he said, "but not because someone fixes you." She looked at him. Really looked. The scar on his temple. The quiet strength in his shoulders, and in his presence she felt something unfamiliar. Sheltered, not kept. That night she whispered to the fire, "Next time, I want to wait with you." McCoy across the lodge didn't move, but his voice reached her like the wind easing through pine. "You already are." It was nearly dusk when the riders came, 5 of them, coats pale as frost, silver buttons gleaming with self-importance. They rode down the ridge like they owned the path, boots muddied from their journey, but eyes sharp with the same entitlement that once named her a gift. Karen saw them first. She was at the smokehouse, hands red from salting deer meat, when her body froze, not from fear, but memory. Her breath drew short. Her shoulders squared. Her fingers curled around the wooden edge of the table, steadying herself against the tide of what once was. McCoy emerged seconds later, already stringing his bow, though he didn't raise it. "Not yet." "They're not soldiers," Karen murmured. "No," McCoy replied, his voice low. "Worse. Witnesses." They stopped a dozen yards away, far enough to feign respect, close enough to carry threat. Their leader wore a blue sash threaded with gold, the kind only councilmen wore, the kind that meant he'd traded treaties with tribes and women with the same ink. "We came to see the girl," the man said, dismounting with a flourish. "The one traded for peace. We have terms to revisit." Karen stepped forward before McCoy could speak. She stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder. "I have no terms left." The man's lips curled into something sharp. "That's not for you to decide. You were a gift, not a party to the agreement." McCoy's voice sliced through the cold like flint. "She walks free now. There is no debt." The councilman approached, slow and deliberate. "You're not her husband. There's no marriage under our law, no binding." Karen's voice rose, not loud but cutting. "There's no ownership either. I buried that." She pointed toward the ridge where the veil now slept beneath earth and pine. "One of your tokens lies up there, the name you gave me, the silence you wrapped around me." One of the younger riders looked away, uncomfortable. Another shifted in the saddle. But their leader pressed on, his tone tight. "We're taking her back. The council has decided. Peace must be seen to continue." McCoy lifted his bow, not drawn, not threatening, just ready. "You'll leave," he said, "or I'll bury the lie you rode in on." The silence that followed wasn't tense. It was final. The men hesitated, then turned their horses. The leader lingered, eyes burning into Karen's face as if he wanted to spit, but didn't dare. "This isn't over," he muttered. Karen didn't flinch. "You're right," she said. "It's just beginning." They rode off, and the wind seemed to breathe again. McCoy exhaled like someone had been holding his chest shut. Karen turned to him. "Did I overstep?" McCoy looked at her, not like a man judging, but like one witnessing truth rise from the ground. "No," he said. "You walked where they feared to." That night, she couldn't sleep. The sky outside was too bright with moonlight, and her thoughts too loud with echoes that didn't belong to her anymore. She rose barefoot and stepped into the clearing, the place where they'd come to reclaim her, the spot where silence had once been a collar around her neck. She knelt in the grass and placed her palms flat to the earth. "You do not name me," she whispered to the dirt. "Not anymore." Behind her, she sensed McCoy's presence, but he didn't speak. He simply sat near, not over, quiet as a breath that didn't need to be drawn for anyone but himself. And that was enough. When she returned to the lodge, her feet cold and bare, she laid beside the fire and whispered, "If they come again, I won't hide." "You never did," McCoy answered softly. "You just forgot how much your silence could shake a mountain." She smiled then, small, real, and the wind curling through the trees outside no longer sounded like a warning. It sounded like applause. The frost arrived early that year. It laced the pine needles before sunrise and carved thin silver veins across the stream bed where Karen bent to fetch water. Her hands ached as she gripped the cold handle of the pail, but she welcomed the pain. It was real. It was hers. It didn't come from someone else's hand. Her shawl slipped as she stood. She didn't notice at first, not until McCoy stepped behind her, carrying the second pail, and stopped. Too late. The scar on her left shoulder caught the light, raised, ragged, curling like a brand. She froze. A breath. A heartbeat. Then she yanked the shawl back over her shoulder and slammed the pail down harder than needed once they reached the lodge. "It's not what you think," she said sharply before he could speak. McCoy didn't respond, just knelt beside the fire, hands resting on his knees. Karen stayed standing, back turned. Her voice came flat, stripped of softness. "It wasn't punishment. It was proof. He said I needed it, so I wouldn't forget who I belonged to." McCoy crushed a sprig of sage in a blackened bowl, the scent rising between them. "He lied," he said. She turned, braid hanging loose, jaw clenched. "I know that now, but knowing doesn't remove it." He looked at her, not the scar. Her. "In my people's way," he said quietly. "When something leaves a mark, we honor the body that survived it. Not to hide it, not to erase it, but to remind it. You lived. You kept walking. She laughed once, sharp and bitter. You going to paint circles on me now? Whisper over my shoulder. Only if you ask, he said. But if you want the scar to mean something new, then let it. She dropped to her knees across from him. The fire warmed one side of her face, the other side stayed in shadow. How? She asked, like someone asking how to breathe underwater. He didn't offer ritual or magic. He just said, you decide. What does it mean now? Her voice trembled, but she didn't hesitate. That I walked away. He nodded. Then we will call it that. From his pouch he tore a thin strip of leather, simple, untreated. Wrap it around it, he said, handing it to her. Not to hide, to name. Her hands didn't shake as they had before. She tied the strip around her shoulder, over the scar, tight but not suffocating, and it didn't burn. It felt like armor, like truth. That night she sat by the fire and didn't dream of doors locked behind her. She dreamed of a quiet stream and a hand reaching, not to claim, not to correct, but to hold. And for the first time, she reached back. The next day, they worked side by side, repairing the inner lining of the lodge, McCoy stitched with precision. Karen fumbled at first, but he never corrected her, just handed her a needle and said, "You'll find your rhythm." She did. In the quiet hours of morning, her hands remembered how to be useful, not obedient, not urgent, just capable. They shared pine tea and laughter, small, uncertain, but real. She caught herself humming again, the tune from her mother. It came without thinking now. McCoy listened. "Sing it louder," he said gently. She didn't. But the sound carried anyway, weaving through the lodge like smoke. That night she reached beneath her bedroll and pulled out the final thing she had kept. A bundle of cloth sewn tight. Inside was her first husband's wedding ring, brass, ugly, heavy. She walked alone to the stream. The water was cold, but it didn't stop her. She held the ring beneath the surface until her fingers went numb. Then she let it go. It sank between two stones. She didn't look back. When she returned, McCoy was waiting by the fire with a pelt over his shoulders, his eyes steady. She didn't speak. She simply sat beside him. And for the first time, she reached for his hand, not as a plea, not as a promise, but as a woman who had chosen to offer something of her own. He met her halfway. No more, no less. Outside, the wind softened. Inside, the fire crackled, and her ribs no longer felt like a cage. They felt like a hearth, warm, ready. The snow melted quietly that spring, slipping down the mountainside in silver threads and soaking the valley with a hush that made everything seem reborn. Karen stood outside the lodge, arms raised to the sky, hanging the finished blanket on the drying line. 12 rows, each one woven by her own hands, slow, careful, unrushed. Each line held a memory, the burial of the veil, the storm they survived together, the scar she chose to name. Nothing repeated, no pattern, just story. She didn't notice McCoy at first, watching her from a few steps away. His arms were crossed over his chest, but his eyes weren't on the blanket. They were on her hands. "You tied the last thread," he said softly. She nodded, brushing a strand of wind-blown hair from her cheek. "And I didn't cry when I did." He stepped forward, not fast, not reaching, just present. "Then maybe now is the time." She turned toward him, puzzled but steady. "Time for what?" McCoy reached into the folds of his coat and drew something out. Her old scarf, the one that had once wrapped the box of ashes, the one that still carried the scent of rosewater and silence. But now it smelled only of thyme and pine. It had been washed, dried, folded with care. "I kept it," he said, placing it in her hands, not to hold the past, but because it smelled like someone who survived it. She looked down at it, fingers tracing the worn edges. "Why now?" she whispered. "Because spring isn't a season here," he said. "It's a choice." He reached for her hand then, not to pull, not to bind, but to guide. He placed it gently over his heart. "And I have chosen you," he said. "Every day you thought no one saw you." Her breath caught. Her heart, still tender, still learning how to be safe in its own skin, trembled beneath his words. "Even when I didn't speak?" she asked. He nodded. "Especially then. Some silences are sacred." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't blink them away. "I have nothing to give you," she said, voice thick with feeling. "Nothing but myself." "That's all I ever asked for," he replied. Then, for the first time, he said the words he had been waiting to speak, not because he needed to hear them, but because she was ready to receive them. "I do not need your service, or your obedience, or your past. I want your mornings, your stubbornness, your hand, freely given." She laughed softly through the ache, the sound light and real. "You sound like no man I've ever known." "Yeah, that's because I was never raised to own what breathes," he said, "only to honor what chooses to stay. I trust." And so she placed her hand in his, fully, firmly, not as an offering of debt, but as a woman who had walked through ash and silence and still chose to bloom. They didn't kiss, they didn't swear vows, but they sat together on the porch he had built, the finished blanket wrapped around their shoulders. They watched the valley stir with color and light. A hawk circled overhead, the stream murmured below, and from Karen's lips came a melody, a song her mother used to hum, a lullaby that had no words, just breath and memory. McCoy closed his eyes to listen, and when the last note faded into the wind, he said only this: "That song will raise our children." Karen blinked, her fingers tightened ever so slightly around his. "Our? If you choose," he said. She smiled. Not a promise, not yet, but something close. "Not yet," she whispered. He nodded. "Then I'll wait, like spring does." And they sat like that until the sun dipped low and the air turned cool. Not two people trying to fix each other, but two souls who had chosen to stay. The snow had long vanished by April, swept downriver in pale ribbons that melted beneath pine shadows and sunlit slopes. In its place, wildflowers crept through the thawing earth, small, delicate bursts of lavender and gold, like forgiveness stitched into the land. Karen stood barefoot outside the lodge, hanging the finished blanket for the last time. The fabric caught the wind like a sail of memory. 12 rows, each one woven with something she'd once believed would break her. It no longer did. She didn't flinch at the wind anymore. She didn't check to see if someone was watching. She had become someone who watched herself, with mercy, with truth. McCoy approached quietly, a basket of pine shoots slung over his shoulder. He stopped a few feet away, not to interrupt, but to witness. "You tied the last thread," he said again softly. Karen nodded. "And this time," she said, "I didn't feel like I was finishing something. I felt like I was beginning it." McCoy set the basket down and stepped forward. "Then maybe now is the time." She turned, eyes catching his, steady and open. "For what?" He reached into his satchel and held out something small, a cedar box, simple, unmarked. "I found this near the creek," he said. "You left it behind." Her breath caught. She hadn't meant to leave it, or maybe she had. The box had once held ashes, a symbol of grief that didn't belong to her anymore. Now it was just wood, an air. She took it from his hand and opened it. Empty, light, like her. "I don't need it," she said. "I know," he replied, "but you should be the one to decide." She smiled and knelt by the fire pit, placing the box into the coals. The wood hissed once, then cracked open like a chest, releasing what it no longer needed to protect. She watched it burn, not with anger, not with sorrow, just release. McCoy stood beside her. "I've asked nothing of you," he said. "I know," she replied, "but I'll ask something now." She looked up. "Will you walk beside me?" he asked. "Not as debt, not as promise, just as yourself." Her throat tightened, but she did not hesitate. "I will." And this time, when she reached for his hand, it was not trembling. It was strong. It was sure. That night, they sat on the porch beneath a sky alive with stars. The valley breathed around them, soft and full. Coyotes sang far in the distance. Wind stirred the trees in quiet rhythm, and Karen felt no weight in her chest, only the steady hum of her own heartbeat, her own choosing. She turned toward McCoy, their hands still entwined, and whispered, "I want to give something back." He didn't ask what, he didn't expect answer, and that was why she could say, myself, all of it, not because I have to, because I want to. He looked at her like the sunrise looks at the mountain, knowing it cannot move it but lighting it anyway. The next morning she found the small spindle McCoy had made for her and carried it to the clearing. She sat in the sun and began to spin thread again, not for survival, not for trade, but for the joy of it. Oui. The motion calmed her, grounded her. Thread by thread her fingers danced through new rhythms, not of what had been taken from her, but of what she now chose to create. Later, she laid the finished blanket inside the lodge, their lodge, and for the first time she didn't think about the woman who had been buried with the veil. She thought of the one who had stitched this cloth with open hands and open heart. That evening McCoy returned from the high ridge, the scent of wild mint clinging to his coat. He saw the blanket folded neatly in the center of the bedroll. He touched it once, then looked up at her. This yours? He asked. She nodded. Ours, if you still want to share it. He crossed to her slowly and placed his hand on her shoulder, over the leather band that still marked the scar. Always, he said, but never by claiming, only by choosing. They lay together that night, wrapped in the warmth of her own weaving, not in possession, but in peace. Outside, the wind moved like breath through the trees. Inside, the fire burned low and quiet, as steady as the life they were beginning, not out of rescue, not out of need, but from the slow, stubborn, sacred act of staying. If this story moved you, if Karen's journey reminded you of your own fight to reclaim your voice, your peace, or your worth, like, share, and subscribe for more true-hearted stories on Oldic Wild West stories. Because sometimes the most powerful stories aren't the ones we're handed. They're the ones we choose to write for ourselves. And if you had heard him say those words, would you have given him your hand too?